welcome to the History Slam podcast from Activehistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, talking about a new book from the University of Regina Press entitled Firewater, How Alcohol is Killing My People and Yours by Harold Johnson, who joins us on the phone. Good morning, Harold.
Good morning, Sean.
How are you today? Life
is good. We're finally getting some cold.
Yeah, it's really starting to turn here at the start of winter and starting to bog down for a long, cold winter, it would appear. And here to talk about your book. You are an interesting guy because, you know, we tend to have a lot of, academics on the show, but you have experience as a Crown prosecutor in Treaty 6 territory, which really lays the framework for what this book is about.
This is just home. This is where I grew up, and this is where I return to.
And so for you, obviously this book, when you think about the title here, it's about alcohol. What prompts this for you in terms of writing a book that is discussing the negative impact of alcohol on not just, obviously, as the title suggests, your community, but all of our community?
There's never one reason for writing a book. There's several. So as you mentioned, as a Crown prosecutor, I witnessed 95% of the people who came into court were intoxicated by alcohol at the time they committed their offense. I've had 2 brothers killed by drunk drivers. I had a teacher, someone that I went to for spiritual and life advice, who told me that he had taught me enough and it was time now for me to get to work. I needed to do something. All of those things all together. That's why I wrote Firewater.
Now, there certainly is I don't know if stereotype's the right word, but a stereotype that alcohol hits the Indigenous community harder than the other communities across the country. In your experience, is that stereotype accurate, or is it more confirmation bias when an Indigenous individual has a alcohol dependency that sort of gets highlighted more than a non-Indigenous individual?
It goes both ways. One, the stereotype is not true. 35% of Aboriginal people in Canada are completely abstinent compared to 18% of Canadians. So there are twice as many Aboriginal people who don't drink at all than in the Canadian population. So that stereotype is statistically wrong.
So where do you think Oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's wrong, and it's true. Aboriginal people have a drinking pattern of binge drinking. So the harms that we experience here I'm just talking about northern Saskatchewan. The leading cause of death in northern Saskatchewan right now is injury at 24.3% of all deaths, compared to Saskatchewan, which has a death rate from injury at about 6%. And that number is inflated because the north brings the province's number up. We know that injury is caused by car accidents, skidoo accidents, drowning, stabbing, shootings, beatings, house fires, suicide, freezing to death. And we know that that is primarily alcohol. Yes, alcohol has a bigger impact on us than in the rest of Canada, even though the numbers of us who drink are less.
Is it a product of that alcohol becomes prominent within specific communities then? Because that number of 35% is certainly higher than what I would have guessed for really any community. You mentioned the national average being much lower than that, which is more in line of what I would guess for really any community across the country. So is it a product of that alcohol and alcoholism becomes a sort of a major issue within specific communities, towns, something like that? Or is the problem widespread?
The problem seems to be widespread. But in each community, so as a Crown prosecutor, I'd fly into a northern community of 1,800 people. And we'd see the same 400 people over and over and over and over again. And doing the same things over and over and over again. What was frustrating about it was we had a judge and a prosecutor and a defense counsel doing the same thing over and over and over again. And everybody wondering why nothing was changing. There'd be people in that community that we would never see. Occasionally, I'd be surprised because I I've been coming here for years. I know all of the surnames of everybody who lives in this community. And then a surname would pop up that I never saw before.
So when you would go into the community as a Crown prosecutor, and you say you would see the same people over and over and over again, what sort of things could you do, or what does the law prescribe in order to help people who have alcohol-related problems or dependency or whatever else it is? Because obviously, this percentage that you just said, 24%, compared to 6% for the provincial average there in Saskatchewan in terms of deaths by injury, that goes beyond, to me at least, in hearing that, a criminal justice issue in terms of sending people to jail, fines, whatever it is. So is there something in the law that would allow a Crown prosecutor such as yourself to help people?
No. Quite bluntly, no. The justice system is not helping. It's not maintaining the status quo. The justice system is making it worse.
In what way?
Residential schools removed people from the communities and erased culture. And that was going on for a long time, back in the 40s, 50s. Before 1960, there were very, very few Aboriginal people in custody. So, beginning in 1960, the incarceration rate of Aboriginal people in Canada began a steady increase that has continued up until today. And nothing that the justice system has done, nothing that the legislature has done, nothing that the Supreme Court has done has made any difference to that rate. And it continues to increase. What happens when you take an Aboriginal person out of the community and put them in a jail is we teach them jailhouse culture. We teach them that the institution is going to feed you, the institution is going to give you shelter, you learn to be disrespectful of authority, you learn that violence solves problems, and then these people return to the community, bringing jailhouse culture back with them. And to many of our youth now who've lost traditional culture, there's a belief that jailhouse culture is Aboriginal culture. So the justice system, by incarcerating people and changing their culture, has changed the culture of pockets in our community.
In thinking about that, does this jailhouse culture that you mentioned, does that then encourage recidivism and having people go back to jail? You mentioned, being fed, housed, all that kind of stuff. Does that encourage that and make it so that going to jail doesn't seem as punitive or as bad?
If everybody in your community has gone to jail, if your dad's been to jail and both of your older brothers and 3 of your uncles, and they've come back and told stories about what it was like, and you know that all of those people are good people, they get drunk and they do stupid things, but most of the time they're good people. They look after their families, they're hunters and they're fishers, and they're just decent to be around. They get drunk and mess up once in a while. So you know that good people can go to jail. So there is no deterrent effect. Deterrence doesn't work anyway. When you're dealing with problems that are almost entirely caused by alcohol, you cannot rely on deterrence, because someone who is intoxicated is not thinking about what a judge is going to say 18 months down the road.
So in your experience, what is the answer in terms of, or potential answer in terms of that, in terms of, I don't know if the word is protecting people when they are drinking and trying to address some of these alcohol-related problems in these communities?
There's a few things the justice system can do. There is a program out of South Dakota called 24/7. If you are charged with domestic violence or impaired driving in South Dakota, there's a chance you're going to be put on a 24/7 order. And if you're on that order, you have to report to a police station twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening, and blow into a breathalyzer. If you fail to show up at the police station, or you blow into the breathalyzer and there's alcohol on your breath, you are put in jail for up to 2 days. Immediate detection, immediate consequences. People don't breathe. We frequently put people on judge's order in Canada to abstain from the consumption of alcohol, and I'm estimating about 85% of those orders are breached. With immediate consequences, people don't breach the orders. The RAND Institute went to South Dakota and studied the program there, and they determined that the incidences of domestic violence were down considerably. Second, impaired driving charges were down considerably. The injury rate to males between the ages of 19 and 40 were also down. But most significantly, the death rate from alcohol in South Dakota was down by about 4%. And they know that it was the 24/7 program because the program was entered into one county at a time across the state, so they're able to track it.
And has that program been exported elsewhere?
It is in several states now. I called the district attorney down there and said, I know you've got Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and I know that Pine Ridge's problems look much the same as what I've got in northern Saskatchewan. How do you get people to the police station there because you've got huge distances and people who don't have vehicles? I said, we use transdermal bracelets. I look into transdermal bracelets. When you drink alcohol, 1% of the alcohol that you drink comes out through your skin unchanged. So that's why you smell like tequila the next day. There's a bracelet that you can put on your ankle. If you consume any alcohol, the bracelet will detect it. The bracelet is foolproof. You can't slip a piece of cellophane in between the bracelet and your skin. You can't put grease on. You can't, a whole bunch of things that will catch you. Looking at states that use transdermal bracelets, they have a breach rate of about 17%. 17% is much better than our 85% that I'm estimating here for breaching judges' orders. And then when you look at the breach rate and break it down, 15% of that was for tampering with the bracelet. So you got this bracelet on, you got it on 24 hours a day, it's on your mind all the time, you're just sitting there trying to figure out how to beat this thing, and it tells on you and calls the police. Only 2% of the breaches were for actual consumption of alcohol.
Which is obviously, as you're saying, much, much lower than the percentage that you're estimating there in northern Saskatchewan. And it seems like, as you say, I mean, the point of these things is, or at least in listening to you and going through the book a little bit, as I said, it's not supposed to be punitive necessarily, but rather to help people. Am I right in suggesting that?
I agree with you. Punishment doesn't work. We've got a highly traumatized population here. So as a Crown prosecutor, I handled about 1,000 files a year, or 1,500 files a year. 1,000 of those with documented trauma. So the person who did it is traumatized. The victim is traumatized. And so are the 5 children who watched. And that's for each of my 1,000 files. There are 11 prosecutors in northern Saskatchewan, so that's 11,000 files, each with multiple trauma victims documented. There's only 38,000 people in northern Saskatchewan. It only takes a few years until that population is traumatized multiple times. So we start adding trauma to this. When a person is traumatized, they experience high anxiety, depression, overwhelming sense of sorrow, in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze. And alcohol ameliorates all of those symptoms. Alcohol is very good medicine for people who are experiencing PTSD. The problem with it is the side effects. You quickly develop a tolerance to alcohol, and it requires more and more. And then the intoxicating aspect, it results in more people being traumatized because of what people do when they're trying to ameliorate their own symptoms of trauma.
So is that account for that higher percentage of alcohol problems then in communities because of, as you mentioned, the trauma effect, but does that then, as you say, suggest spread through the community so that if I, as a son, if I see my parents having trauma, does the trauma pass to me in the same way that I would then be more likely to become dependent on alcohol in the same way?
If your parents have PTSD or symptoms of trauma, those symptoms are going to be amplified in you. Your trauma is going to be worse than theirs. These are studies done by people who've gone to residential schools, and generations down the line, the symptoms are greater than the person who went to residential school.
What accounts for that?
I don't know. I'm not a psychologist.
Yeah.
But trauma is only one aspect of it. Trauma is just one part of it. There's, like I said at the beginning, there's never one reason for anything. It's not simple. We also have the social determinants of health. So in Ottawa, there will be communities where the life expectancy would be 60, 65 years old. And in Ottawa, in richer communities, the life expectancy will be 80, 85 years. And that's just within Ottawa. In those pockets that are lower social, where wealth comes into play, lower incomes, all of those things, there's more crime as well, more drinking. And isn't because of wealth disparities entirely. That's part of it. The difference is in hope. In wealthier communities, people have hope. In poorer communities, they don't. So if you don't have any hope that there's going to be a tomorrow, it's more likely that you're going to eat that piece of cake today and not worry about your waistline. And so we have higher obesity rates. You're not going to worry about tomorrow and you're going to drink all of that whiskey today. You're going to spend the money that you have today and you're not going to worry about the end of the month because you don't have hope that the end of the month is going to get here.
Right, and it seems like for me, you talk about trauma and the lack of hope, that those two things are intermixed as well, that sort of going through traumatic experiences and that snowball effect that you mentioned where it gets worse, that would affect the sense of hope within these communities. And so it becomes more than, as you say, more than an economic issue, more than purely a trauma issue. It becomes sort of this mass effect of all these different issues coming together that is seriously hurting these communities. And, I have friends and people here in Ottawa who always, or who, when we discuss issues like this, that it seems to me that people want a quick fix for these type of problems. But in listening to you talk, it's clear that there's something that's going to fix this tomorrow. Yeah. And it's we need a multifaceted approach. And
that is what we're working on. The Northern Alcohol Strategy that I am part of today is working on bringing all of the institutions, justice, healthcare, education, policing, Chamber of Commerce, municipal, band governments, all together to work on changing the story that we tell ourselves about alcohol. And I believe that is the only way that we're going to change it. Justice can't do it by itself. Healthcare has lots of tools, but they can't fix it by themselves. Education is learning. There are evidence-based approaches for teaching or talking to youth about alcohol that are being implemented. But we need everybody. We need the churches on board. We need the sweat lodge keepers. We need the pipe carriers. We need powwow dancers. We need hockey teams to be on board.
And how much of this goes beyond the Indigenous communities? Because the subtitle of the book, of course, refers my people and yours. That sort of this is a broad macro communal issue for everybody across the country, and it seems to me that obviously that we all have a part in this process.
Oh, absolutely. The cancer agencies across Canada met, and they wanted to talk about how do we message to Canadians about the risks of cancer from consuming alcohol. And there are several cancers that are directly related to consumption of alcohol. For example, if a woman has one drink a day, it increases the risk of breast cancer substantially. Cancer agencies have come together trying to figure out how do we bring this message to Canadians. And there's fear in the room. We are back in that situation where we were a few decades ago when we started talking about tobacco and cancer and the reaction from the industry. And we know that backlash is coming. We start talking about cancer and alcohol, that industry is going to react the same way that the tobacco industry did. So we've got a big problem. We've got a lot of serious work to do across Canada and around the world. And the World Health Organization is way ahead on this. Canada's quite behind. Countries like Scotland and Finland are way ahead of Canada and creating strategies to deal with alcohol.
Yeah, and there's that divide, right? Because here in Ontario, not to get overly political, but our premier, he ran in part on reducing the price of beer. He's implemented a change in how long alcohol can be sold. The hours have been extended so that you can buy alcohol as late as 11 p.m. in the LCBO, the provincial retailer here. So you're right. There's this sort of disconnect between this cultural prevalence of alcohol in this country and these studies that continue to come out showing its negative health effects. And it just seems like across the country we are, as a group, as a collective, willing to ignore these things despite the evidence to the contrary.
Most people are unaware of the evidence.
Hmm.
Most people in Canada, and probably most of the people who voted for $1 beer, are unaware that alcohol causes cancer. They're unaware that heavy alcohol use damages the heart. They haven't been told that alcohol is responsible for over 200 illnesses and injuries. They simply don't know. It's going to be interesting to watch Ontario in the next few years. The increases in violence, the damages to health, the decreases in education, all of those things are going to come into play. It's going to be interesting to watch the numbers between Canada and more responsible provinces, or between Ontario and more responsible provinces. A 1% increase in the price of alcohol in the United States, study showed a 3% decrease in domestic violence.
That's remarkable. And now here we are in this province doing the opposite of that, or attempting to do the opposite of that, in terms of the price.
Yeah. The industry is a powerful lobby. I was told by government people when I began this project of taking on alcohol that I should avoid tackling the industry because the industry is such a powerful lobby that I would not succeed.
Well, have you come up to any resistance from industry people? Have you heard from anybody?
No, not directly because I haven't challenged industry.
Okay.
But the Yukon Territory tried to put warnings on alcohol bottles, warning that alcohol caused cancer, and were threatened by the industry. And you've got to remember, the Yukon Territory isn't very big. I think there's like 30,000 people who live there in total. They don't have a huge tax base. They couldn't afford to take on the industry in a court battle. And the territory withdrew. They were bullied into taking the warnings off the bottles by the industry. That was just within the last year.
You do wonder what would happen if it was a more populous province that might have more sway? I don't know. Or would the industry, do you think, just come back harder on that?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I know that British Columbia feels confident enough to bring a lawsuit against the opiate distributors.
Oh.
But they don't have, because of the harms caused by opiates in British Columbia. But they don't have the courage to take on alcohol, which is doing far more damage.
Yes, as is described in the book, again, Firewater, How Alcohol is Killing My People and Yours. And now Harold, I've very much enjoyed this, but I do also, because I don't have much time left with you, unfortunately, I want to talk about your other new book entitled Clifford that recently came out, and this is a book, it's described here as sort of equal parts memoir, science fiction, and fantasy about the life and death of your older brother. So I'm just curious. We talked about it a little bit before we started recording that, you know, in listening to your description of your brother, it basically sounded like a genius.
He probably was. I don't know what genius means.
Yeah. Smarter than me. Well, he's definitely smarter than me, but that's not a high bar. So
he was capable of thinking at levels that most people don't even attempt. Put it that way.
Yeah, so you know, the science part of this, you mentioned that he came up with or solved basically quantum weirdness, which is this, as you describe it. By the way, I love that when you described it to me, I was able to kind of understand it in basically, you know, the minute that you described it, which is very hard for any scientific concept to go forward.
Yeah, the reason I wrote, one of the reasons, like I said repeatedly here, there's never one reason for anything. But one of the reasons I wrote Clifford is because I wanted to bring those ideas about science, about quantum physics, about solving the theory of everything, gravity, the strong force in the atom, the weak force in the atom, electromagnetism, and bring them all together and explain them in a way that I couldn't any other way. I tried writing them as scientific articles, and they just fell flat. But when Clifford explained them, it worked. People are able to grasp concepts like uncertainty, quantum weirdness, the theory of everything, and solve the Big Bang Theory.
Oh, really?
Yeah. According to this theory of Clifford's, there was no Big Bang. The universe is in a constant state of expansion because it's surrounded by a void. And the void is eating the universe. But as it eats the universe, it is stretching the universe in all directions. And when you stretch something, you put energy into it, like an elastic band. If you took an elastic band and weighed it and then stretched it and weighed it again, it would weigh more when it was stretched because it has more energy in it. The same thing is happening to our universe because it's surrounded by a void. And that stretching, energy and mass are the same thing. That's Einstein's theory, E equals mc squared. So the energy that's being put into the universe by it being devoured creates the mass of the universe. So the universe is in a constant state of being destroyed and created. And that when we look out at the universe and it looks like it's expanding everywhere, that's all that we're seeing.
Wow. That's pretty deep for a Saturday morning as we record this, to think about all that. But we would definitely encourage everybody to get that book. It is titled Clifford by Harold R. Johnson, and we would certainly encourage you to get that, as well as Firewater, How Alcohol is Killing My People and Yours. Harold Johnson, thank you so much for the time this morning. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Thanks for having me on, Sean.
If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can find us at historyslam@gmail.com. I am at Dr. Shawnee Fever on Twitter. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show on Google Play, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your show. Give us the likes, ratings, all that fun stuff to keep the show going. And we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.